The young Princess Elizabeth stood nervously in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, watching her parents, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, effortlessly glide from one group of dignitaries to another. At just 16 years old, she was being groomed for a life of endless conversations with strangers, and the prospect terrified her more than any mathematics lesson or riding accident ever could. "Your Royal Highness," whispered her governess, Marion Crawford, "remember what we practiced. Ask about their journey, their family, or something they might be passionate about. People love talking about themselves." Elizabeth nodded, smoothing down her pale blue dress and taking a deep breath. She had been studying the guest list for weeks, memorizing names, titles, and small details about each person attending tonight's reception for Commonwealth ambassadors. Her father had insisted she begin taking on more official duties, preparing her for the throne that seemed impossibly distant yet increasingly inevitable. The first test came when Lord Pemberton, the aging ambassador from Canada, approached with his wife. Elizabeth had read that he was an avid gardener who had recently won a prize for his roses. Instead of the formal greeting she had rehearsed, something more natural emerged. "Lord Pemberton," she said with a genuine smile, "I heard wonderful things about your garden. Mama mentioned you've had remarkable success with your roses this season." The ambassador's entire face lit up. "Your Royal Highness, you're very kind to ask. Indeed, my double delight variety has been exceptional this year. The secret, I've discovered, is in the morning watering schedule and just the right amount of bone meal in early spring." What followed was a 15-minute animated discussion about soil conditions, pruning techniques, and the challenges of growing roses in the Canadian climate versus the English countryside. Elizabeth found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that came naturally rather than from her prepared list. Lady Pemberton joined in, sharing stories about their greenhouse and the local gardening club they had started in Ottawa. As the conversation flowed, Elizabeth realized something remarkable was happening. She wasn't just performing her royal duty, she was actually enjoying herself. The nervousness that had knotted her stomach was gradually dissolving, replaced by a warm feeling of connection. When the couple eventually moved on, both were beaming, and Lord Pemberton was heard telling other guests about the young princess's remarkable knowledge and interest in horticulture. "Well done, Lilibet," her mother whispered as she passed by. "You found key." But Elizabeth's education and conversation was far from over. The next challenge came in the form of Mrs. Kowalski, the wife of the Polish ambassador, who spoke limited English and seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of the palace. The woman stood alone near the refreshment table, looking lost and somewhat frightened. Elizabeth approached slowly, remembering her French lessons and the few Polish phrases Marion Crawford had taught her earlier that week. "Good evening," she began in carefully pronounced Polish. The effect was immediate and magical. Mrs. Kowalski's face transformed from anxiety to pure joy. "Oh, your Royal Highness speaks Polish," she exclaimed in accented English. "This is wonderful surprise." They spent the next 20 minutes talking about Mrs. Kowalski's children, her homeland, and her impressions of London. Elizabeth discovered that the woman was homesick and worried about family members still in war-torn Poland. By the end of their conversation, Mrs. Kowalski was laughing and sharing photographs of her grandchildren, completely at ease in the palace that had intimidated her minutes before. Throughout the evening, Elizabeth continued her practice. She spoke with a young diplomat from India about cricket, having remembered reading that his region had produced several talented players. She discussed music with the Austrian cultural attaché, drawing on her piano lessons to ask intelligent questions about Vienna's musical heritage. With each conversation, she grew more confident and more skilled at finding that magical connection point where formal duty transformed into genuine human interaction. Her father watched from across the room, noting how naturally his daughter was developing what would become one of her greatest strengths. King George VI himself had struggled with public speaking and social interactions, his stutter making formal events a source of anxiety rather than pleasure. Seeing Elizabeth navigate these conversations with increasing ease filled him with both pride and relief. As the evening wound down, Elizabeth reflected on what she had learned. It wasn't just about memorizing facts about people, though preparation certainly helped. The real secret lay in genuine curiosity about others, in listening carefully to what they said, and in finding ways to make each person feel valued and interesting. She had discovered that even the most mundane topics could become fascinating when approached with the right attitude. The skills she was developing would serve her well in the years to come. World War II was raging, and soon she would be visiting hospitals, factories, and military bases, meeting people from all walks of life. Each conversation would be an opportunity to boost morale, show royal interest in their welfare, and demonstrate that the monarchy cared about ordinary citizens. But more than that, Elizabeth was beginning to understand that small talk wasn't small at all. It was the foundation of human connection, the bridge between strangers, and, perhaps most importantly for a future monarch, the tool that could make the crown relevant and accessible to people who might otherwise see royalty as distant and irrelevant. As she climbed the grand staircase to her rooms that night, Elizabeth felt she had crossed an important threshold. The shy, nervous girl who had dreaded this evening was evolving into someone who could hold her own in any social situation. Little did she know that this was just the beginning of a lifelong journey that would take her from palace ballrooms to remote villages, from heads of state to ordinary citizens, always armed with a growing mastery of the art that would define her reign. The lessons learned in that Buckingham Palace ballroom would echo through decades of public service, shaping not just her approach to royal duties, but her understanding of what it meant to truly serve her people. Each small conversation was practice for the thousands that would follow, each successful interaction building the confidence and skill that would make her one of history's most effective monarchs. In her diary that night, she wrote simply, "Learned that talking to people isn't as frightening as I thought. Perhaps I can do this after all." It was a modest assessment of what would prove to be the beginning of an extraordinary journey in human connection. The rain drummed steadily against the windows of the military hospital in Surrey as Princess Elizabeth, now 20 years old, walked down the long corridor lined with wounded soldiers. The year was 1946, and Britain was slowly rebuilding after the devastation of World War II. These hospital visits had become a regular part of her royal duties, but they presented challenges far different from the polished diplomatic receptions she had mastered. Here, there were no prepared conversation topics or briefing notes about rose gardens and cricket scores. Instead, she faced young men who had lost limbs, suffered burns, or carried invisible wounds that showed in their haunted eyes. Many were her own age or younger, and their pain was raw and immediate. "Your Royal Highness," the head nurse whispered as they approached the first ward. "Sergeant Williams in bed 3 has been particularly difficult. He hasn't spoken to anyone in weeks, not even his family. Perhaps it's best to just acknowledge him and move on." Elizabeth nodded, but made a mental note of the sergeant's name. She had learned that sometimes the most challenging conversations were the most important ones. As she moved through the ward, she applied the lessons she had absorbed over the past few years, but adapted them for this very different environment. With Private Johnson, who was learning to walk again with prosthetic legs, she didn't offer empty sympathy. Instead, she asked about the physical therapy process, showing genuine interest in the technical aspects of his rehabilitation. "The mechanisms look quite sophisticated," she observed, examining his artificial limbs with curiosity rather than pity. "How do they attach? Does the balance feel different?" Johnson, initially stiff and formal, gradually relaxed as he explained the engineering behind his prosthetics and the daily challenges of relearning basic movements. The conversation shifted from his disability to his expertise in adapting to it, restoring a sense of dignity and accomplishment that medical discussions often overlooked. When she reached Sergeant Williams, Elizabeth paused at his bedside. The young man stared at the ceiling, his face turned away from her approach. The other patients in the ward watched nervously, wondering if the princess would simply move on as the nurse had suggested. Instead, Elizabeth sat down in the chair beside his bed. She noticed a worn photograph on his bedside table showing a young woman holding a small child. "That's a beautiful family photograph," she said simply. "Your wife and child?" Silence stretched between them for several long minutes. Elizabeth didn't fill the space with nervous chatter or move on to the next patient. She simply sat, occasionally glancing at the photograph, waiting. Finally, almost reluctantly, Williams turned his head slightly. "My son," he said quietly. "Tommy. He's 3 now. Doesn't recognize me when I come home on leave." His voice was barely a whisper, filled with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. "3 is such a wonderful age," she said. "Everything is new and exciting to them. What does Tommy like to play with?" What followed was a halting but increasingly animated conversation about toy trucks, picture books, and a little boy who was fascinated by horses but afraid of loud noises. Williams shared how Tommy would hide behind his mother's skirts when he came home, and how helpless he felt trying to connect with his own child. "Children are remarkably adaptable," Elizabeth offered gently. "Perhaps he just needs time to get used to having his father home. Have you tried building something together?" Children love having important jobs to do. By the time she rose to continue her rounds, Williams was sitting up in bed, engaged, and talking for the first time in weeks. The head nurse watched in amazement as other patients began asking questions and joining the conversation. The entire atmosphere of the ward transformed by one successful human connection. As Elizabeth moved through the hospital, she encountered Lance Corporal Davies, a Welsh coal miner before the war, who had lost his right hand in France. He was withdrawn and bitter, convinced that his mining days were over and struggling to see any future for himself. Elizabeth had done her homework. She knew about the coal industry, the pride miners took in their dangerous work, and the tight-knit communities that supported them. Instead of offering sympathy for his injury, she asked about mining techniques, the geology of Welsh coal seams, and the skills required for underground work. "I imagine the strength and precision needed for mining involves much more than just physical power," she said thoughtfully. "There must be tremendous skill in reading the rock formations and understanding safety procedures." Davies looked at her with surprise, then began explaining the complexities of his former profession. As he talked about supporting tunnel structures, managing ventilation systems, and training younger miners, he gradually realized that much of his knowledge and experience could be applied to other fields. The conversation planted seeds of possibility where there had been only despair. Later that day, Elizabeth visited the children's wing, where young patients presented entirely different challenges. Here, her approach had to shift completely. With 8-year-old Mary, who was recovering from tuberculosis and hadn't seen her family in months, Elizabeth didn't talk down to her or offer false cheerfulness. Instead, she asked Mary to teach her a card game. "I'm terrible at cards," Elizabeth confessed, "but I'm willing to learn if you're patient with me." As Mary explained the rules and demonstrated techniques, she transformed from a withdrawn, homesick child into a confident teacher, proud to instruct a real princess in something she had mastered. The hospital visits revealed new dimensions of Elizabeth's growing expertise in conversation. She learned to read body language, to understand when silence was more valuable than words, and to find topics that would restore dignity rather than highlight limitations. Each patient taught her something different about resilience, hope, and the power of being truly heard. Word of her approach began to spread throughout the hospital system. Nurses reported that patients looked forward to royal visits with excitement rather than anxiety, and that the positive effects lasted long after Elizabeth had departed. Her ability to engage authentically with people in crisis was becoming legendary among medical staff. Dr. Margaret Foster, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, observed several of Elizabeth's interactions and was impressed by her intuitive understanding of human psychology. "Your Royal Highness has a gift," she told Elizabeth after one particularly successful visit. "You seem to know exactly what each person needs to hear." Elizabeth reflected on this comment as she traveled back to London. She was beginning to understand that effective conversation was less about what she said and more about what she enabled others to say. Her role was to create space for people to share their stories, their expertise, their hopes, and fears. The princess was learning to be a catalyst for human expression rather than the center of attention. These hospital experiences were shaping Elizabeth's understanding of her future role as queen. She was discovering that monarchy's power lay not in grand pronouncements or ceremonial displays, but in countless small moments of connection with individual subjects. Each conversation was an opportunity to represent hope, continuity, and genuine care for the welfare of her people. The skills she developed moving between traumatized soldiers, homesick children, and worried families would prove invaluable in the decades ahead. She was learning to adapt her conversational style to meet people where they were emotionally, to find common ground across vast differences in experience and background, and to leave every person feeling that their story mattered to the crown. As her car pulled through the gates of Buckingham Palace that evening, Elizabeth carried with her the voices and stories of dozens of individuals who had shared pieces of their lives with her. Each conversation had been a masterclass in human nature, and she was rapidly becoming one of the most skilled practitioners of the art she would need most as queen: the ability to connect authentically with any person in any circumstance, making each encounter meaningful for both parties involved. The coronation was behind her, and 27-year-old Queen Elizabeth II was embarking on her first major Commonwealth tour as sovereign. The year was 1953, and she faced the daunting challenge of connecting with millions of subjects across vastly different cultures, climates, and social contexts. From the sheep stations of Australia to the tea plantations of Ceylon, from Maori tribal meetings in New Zealand to formal state dinners in Canada, she would need to master the art of conversation across every conceivable barrier. The tour began in Bermuda, where Elizabeth encountered her first major test of cross-cultural communication. At a reception for local dignitaries, she met Mrs. Sarah Tucker, an elderly woman who had lived on the island for 70 years and represented 4 generations of Bermudian families. Mrs. Tucker spoke in a thick local dialect that Elizabeth initially found difficult to understand. "Your Majesty," Mrs. Tucker said in her musical Caribbean-influenced accent, "we've been waiting such a long time to meet our queen proper-like. My great-grandmother, she remembered when the first royal visit happened, back in Queen Victoria's time." Elizabeth leaned in closer, not just to hear better, but to show respect for Mrs. Tucker's words. She had learned that understanding wasn't just about language. It was about demonstrating that every voice mattered equally, regardless of accent, education, or social status. "Please tell me about your great-grandmother," Elizabeth requested. What stories did she share about that earlier visit? As Mrs. Tucker began relating family memories passed down through generations, Elizabeth discovered a treasure trove of local history. She learned about hurricane survival, traditional fishing methods, and the tight-knit community spirit that had sustained families through decades of challenges. The conversation revealed insights no briefing document could provide. When they reached Jamaica, Elizabeth faced an even more complex cultural landscape. The island was still recovering from social tensions, and many residents were unsure about their relationship with the British Crown. At a community gathering in Kingston, she encountered both enthusiastic supporters and politely skeptical observers. Young Marcus Campbell, a university student and future teacher, approached with obvious nervousness but also determination. "Your Majesty," he began formally, "many of us young people wonder what the monarchy means for our future as Jamaicans." It was a direct challenge wrapped in respectful language, exactly the kind of conversation that could either bridge differences or create wider divisions. Elizabeth paused, considering her response carefully. She had learned that authentic engagement sometimes required addressing difficult questions rather than deflecting them. "That's an important question, Marcus," she said, using his first name to signal equality and respect. "I believe the Crown's role should be to support each nation's own path to prosperity and self-determination. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about what that future should look like." What followed was a fascinating discussion about education, economic development, and cultural identity. Marcus shared his hopes for expanding university access and preserving Jamaican traditions while embracing modern opportunities. Elizabeth listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about his studies and his plans for contributing to his community's development. Other young people gradually joined the conversation, and Elizabeth found herself in an impromptu forum about youth aspirations, social change, and the relevance of traditional institutions in a rapidly modernizing world. Rather than defending the monarchy or offering empty promises, she focused on understanding their perspectives and showing genuine interest in their individual goals. The tour continued to Australia, where Elizabeth encountered the vast social diversity of the continent. In Sydney, she met with recent European immigrants who were rebuilding lives far from their homelands. In the outback, she sat with cattle station families whose nearest neighbors lived hundreds of miles away. Each environment demanded different conversational approaches. At a cattle station in Queensland, she spent an afternoon with the Morrison family, who managed thousands of acres with a combination of modern techniques and generations-old knowledge. Jack Morrison, the station owner, was a man of few words who viewed the royal visit with good-natured skepticism. "Reckon you might find this a bit different from palace life, Your Majesty," he said with a slight grin, gesturing toward the endless red landscape. Elizabeth surprised him by asking detailed questions about drought management, cattle breeding, and the logistics of supplying remote properties. She had studied agricultural reports before the visit, but more importantly, she approached the conversation with genuine curiosity about challenges she had never faced. "How do you maintain community connections when your neighbors are so far away?" she asked. "And how do the children receive their education?" Jack's reserved demeanor gradually warmed as he explained the flying doctor service, correspondence schools, and the radio networks that kept isolated families connected. His wife, Betty, joined the conversation, describing how women organized support systems across vast distances and maintained cultural activities despite physical isolation. Elizabeth spent hours learning about practical problem-solving, community resilience, and the particular kind of strength required for life in harsh environments. The conversation revealed leadership lessons that no textbook could provide, and she left the station with a deeper understanding of how ordinary people faced extraordinary challenges. In New Zealand, Elizabeth encountered Maori culture, which required her to learn entirely new protocols for respectful interaction. At a traditional meeting house, she participated in a pauhaere ceremony and engaged in conversations that blended formal respect with personal warmth. Te Rengi Williams, an elder and tribal leader, spoke to her about land rights, cultural preservation, and the balance between honoring traditions and adapting to modern life. Elizabeth had prepared by learning basic Maori phrases and studying the history of European Maori relations, but she quickly discovered that successful communication required much more than language preparation. "Your Majesty," Te Rengi said through an interpreter, "our people have always believed that true leadership comes from understanding the stories of those you serve." "What stories have you learned on your journey?" It was a profound question that challenged Elizabeth to articulate what she was discovering about her role and her people. Instead of offering a diplomatic response, she spoke honestly about the farmers who taught her about resilience, the veterans who showed her different kinds of courage, and the immigrants who demonstrated the strength required to build new lives. The conversation continued for hours, touching on spirituality, community responsibility, and the ways that leadership traditions could evolve while maintaining their essential values. Elizabeth found herself engaging with concepts of service and duty that resonated deeply with her own understanding of monarchy, but expressed through completely different cultural frameworks. By the time the Commonwealth tour concluded, Elizabeth had participated in thousands of conversations across every imaginable social context. She had learned to adapt her communication style to rural farmers and urban intellectuals, to children and elderly citizens, to enthusiastic supporters and thoughtful skeptics. More importantly, she had discovered that effective conversation was less about representing the crown and more about representing genuine human curiosity and respect. Each successful interaction had taught her something new about leadership, about the diverse needs and hopes of her subjects, and about the unifying power of authentic interest in others' experiences. The tour established patterns that would define Elizabeth's reign for decades to come. She had learned that small talk was actually the foundation of effective governance, that personal connections were more powerful than formal pronouncements, and that a monarch's greatest strength lay in the ability to make every citizen feel heard and valued. As the royal yacht Britannia sailed toward home, Elizabeth reflected on the transformation she had undergone. The nervous young woman who had struggled with her first diplomatic reception had evolved into someone capable of meaningful conversation with anyone, anywhere, under any circumstances. She had mastered not just the art of small talk, but the deeper skill of using conversation as a tool for understanding, connection, and service. The Commonwealth had tested her abilities and confirmed her instincts. She was ready to spend the rest of her life in conversation with her people, one meaningful interaction at a time. The 1970s brought unprecedented social changes to Britain, and Queen Elizabeth found herself navigating conversations across generational divides that seemed wider than ever before. Young people were questioning traditional institutions, social movements were demanding equality, and the monarchy itself faced scrutiny from critics who wondered about its relevance in a rapidly modernizing world. A university visit in Manchester, Elizabeth encountered the full force of these changing times. The students who gathered to meet her were polite, but skeptical, their questions more direct and challenging than anything she had faced in previous decades. Among them was Sarah Henderson, a sociology student with long hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and strong opinions about social justice. "Your Majesty," Sarah began with careful courtesy, but unmistakable firmness, "many of us struggle to understand how an inherited position can be relevant in an era when we're fighting for merit-based advancement and equality of opportunity." It was exactly the kind of fundamental challenge that could either create a productive dialogue or result in an awkward standoff. Elizabeth had learned over the years that the most difficult questions often provided the most valuable opportunities for genuine connection. "That's a fair question, Sarah," the Queen replied, settling into her chair and giving the student her full attention. "I've often wondered the same thing myself. Perhaps you could help me understand what merit-based advancement means to you and your generation." The approach was masterful in its simplicity. Instead of defending the monarchy or offering rehearsed justifications, Elizabeth turned the conversation toward understanding the student's perspective and concerns. Sarah, clearly surprised by the direct engagement, began explaining her views about social mobility, educational opportunities, and the barriers that prevented talented individuals from reaching their potential. As the conversation developed, other students joined in, creating an unexpected forum about social change, institutional reform, and the evolving role of traditional structures in modern society. Elizabeth listened carefully, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest in their ideas, while sharing observations about the social changes she had witnessed during her reign. "You're right that inherited positions don't automatically confer merit," Elizabeth acknowledged. "But perhaps the question isn't whether institutions should exist, but how they can evolve to serve society more effectively. What changes would you want to see?" The discussion continued for over an hour, touching on topics from educational funding to women's rights to racial equality. Elizabeth found herself learning as much as she was sharing, gaining insights into the hopes and frustrations of a generation that would shape Britain's future. Later that year, during a visit to a London comprehensive school in a working-class neighborhood, Elizabeth encountered different, but equally complex social realities. The students here faced challenges that university students, despite their social concerns, rarely experience directly: poverty, limited opportunities, and the daily struggle to envision better futures. 12-year-old Kevin Thompson approached her during a classroom visit with a mixture of curiosity and defiance that was characteristic of his age and circumstances. "Miss," I mean, Your Majesty, he began awkwardly. My dad says the royal family doesn't care about people like us. Is that true? The question, delivered with startling directness, created a moment of silence in the classroom. Teachers looked nervous, wondering how the Queen would respond to such an unfiltered challenge from a child. Elizabeth knelt down to Kevin's eye level, a gesture that immediately changed the dynamic from formal distance to personal connection. What does people like us mean to you, Kevin? She asked gently. Tell me about your family and what's important to them. Kevin began describing his father's work as a bus driver, his mother's part-time job at a local shop, and his own dreams of becoming a mechanic. As he talked, other students joined the conversation, sharing stories about their families, their neighborhoods, and their aspirations. Elizabeth listened intently, asking questions about their schools, their hobbies, and their hopes for the future. The conversation revealed deep insights into the daily realities of working-class families. Parents working multiple jobs, children taking on adult responsibilities, and communities supporting each other through economic hardships. Elizabeth realized that her understanding of these challenges had been largely theoretical, filtered through official reports and carefully managed visits. Kevin, she said thoughtfully, I think your father might be partially right. Sometimes people in my position don't understand what life is really like for most families. But conversations like this help me learn. Would you be willing to teach me more? The rest of the visit became an impromptu education session, with students describing their neighborhoods, their family traditions, and the challenges they faced in school. Elizabeth found herself engaged in discussions about everything from football teams to part-time jobs to the complicated relationships between different ethnic communities in their area. One particularly memorable conversation occurred with Amelia Patel, a 15-year-old daughter of Indian immigrants who was struggling to balance her family's traditional expectations with her own ambitions to become a doctor. My parents wanted to focus on marriage and family, Amelia explained, but I want to study medicine. How do you balance duty to family with personal dreams? Elizabeth paused, recognizing the complexity of the question and its personal relevance to her own life. That's one of the most difficult challenges anyone can face, she said honestly. I've had to make choices between personal preferences and family responsibilities too. But I've learned that sometimes you can honor both by finding ways to serve that match your abilities and interests. The conversation that followed explored themes of duty, family loyalty, cultural identity, and personal fulfillment. Elizabeth shared insights about finding purpose within constraints while encouraging Amelia to pursue her educational goals. Other students joined in, creating a rich discussion about balancing competing loyalties and expectations. During a visit to a community center in Birmingham, Elizabeth encountered another dimension of social change when she met with local activists working on racial equality issues. Among them was David Williams, a young black teacher who was involved in organizing better educational opportunities for minority students. Your Majesty, David said with careful respect but clear determination, our community faces discrimination in employment, housing, and education. What role can the Crown play in addressing these inequalities? Elizabeth had been preparing for such conversations as social awareness of racial issues increased throughout the decade. She knew that her response would be scrutinized not just by those present, but by communities across Britain and the Commonwealth. Those are serious injustices that affect the entire society, she replied. While I can't involve myself in political solutions, I can certainly learn more about these challenges and use my position to highlight the contributions and needs of all communities. Would you help me understand what specific changes would make the most difference? The resulting conversation was one of the most important of Elizabeth's reign. David and other community leaders shared detailed accounts of systemic discrimination, explained the barriers that prevented equal participation in British society, and described their efforts to create change through education and community organizing. Elizabeth listened with intensity that surprised the activists. She asked specific questions about educational programs, community needs, and successful integration initiatives. More importantly, She demonstrated through her attention and follow-up questions that she was taking their concerns seriously and incorporating their insights into her understanding of contemporary Britain. Throughout the 1970s, these challenging conversations taught Elizabeth that effective monarchy in a democratic society required constant adaptation and genuine engagement with social change. She learned to address difficult topics without defensiveness, to acknowledge problems without claiming to have solutions, and to use her position to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard. The decade also revealed the growing sophistication of Elizabeth's conversational abilities. She had learned to navigate complex social and political topics, to engage with criticism constructively, and to find common ground with people whose backgrounds and beliefs were vastly different from her own. Most importantly, she discovered that the art of small talk was evolving into something much more significant. The ability to facilitate national conversations about important issues, to bridge generational and cultural divides, and to help diverse communities understand each other better. By the end of the decade, Elizabeth had established herself not just as a skilled conversationalist, but as a unique figure who could engage meaningfully with any segment of British society. Her ability to listen without judgment, to ask thoughtful questions, and to find human connections across any barrier had become one of the monarchy's most valuable assets in an era of rapid social transformation. By the 1990s and into the new millennium, Queen Elizabeth II had perfected the art of conversation across 7 decades of public service. Now in her 70s and 80s, she faced entirely new challenges. Rapid technological changes that transformed how people communicated, global crises that required delicate diplomatic conversations, and personal family controversies that tested her ability to maintain dignity while addressing difficult subjects. The digital revolution presented unexpected opportunities for the Queen to demonstrate her conversational mastery in new contexts. During a visit to a technology company in Cambridge, she encountered a group of young programmers who were developing early internet applications. Among them was 25-year-old Michael Chun, a software engineer who seemed nervous about explaining his work to someone from a completely different generation. "Your Majesty," Michael began hesitantly, "I'm not sure how to explain computer programming to someone who didn't grow up with this technology." Elizabeth surprised him by leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "I'd like to understand how it works," she said simply. "Could you show me what you're creating and explain it as if I were learning it for the first time?" What followed was a fascinating conversation about logic, problem-solving, and creativity in the digital age. Elizabeth asked thoughtful questions about the practical applications of the software, how it might help people communicate more effectively, and what challenges the programmers faced in their work. Michael found himself explaining complex concepts in simple terms while discovering that the fundamental principles of his work, logical thinking, attention to detail, and serving user needs, weren't so different from principles that applied in many fields. "It sounds like programming requires the same kind of systematic thinking that goes into organizing a large event or managing complex schedules," Elizabeth observed. "The tools are different, but the underlying approach seems familiar." The conversation revealed Elizabeth's remarkable ability to find connections between vastly different types of work and to make people feel that their expertise was valued and understood, regardless of the technological divide between generations. As global communications evolved, Elizabeth's diplomatic conversations became increasingly complex and significant. During the post-Cold War period, she hosted visits from former Soviet leaders and participated in delicate discussions about reconciliation and international cooperation. Her conversation with Mikhail Gorbachev during a state visit exemplified her skill at navigating politically sensitive topics through personal connection. "Mr. Gorbachev," she said during a private moment at Windsor Castle, "the changes you initiated required tremendous courage. What gave you the strength to pursue such fundamental reforms despite the personal risks?" The question opened a door to a remarkable conversation about leadership, historical responsibility, and the personal costs of political transformation. Gorbachev shared insights about the internal struggles within the Soviet system, the difficult decisions required to end the Cold War, and his hopes for future international cooperation. Elizabeth listened with the attention she had refined over decades, asking questions that demonstrated deep understanding of the historical significance of their conversation. She shared her own observations about the changes she had witnessed during her reign, creating a dialogue between two leaders who had shaped the latter half of the 20th century. History will judge whether our decisions were wise, she reflected. But I believe we both understand the weight of serving during times of great change. The conversation continued for hours, touching on topics from nuclear disarmament to cultural exchange to the challenges of maintaining national identity while embracing international cooperation. Both leaders later described it as one of the most meaningful discussions of their careers. Elizabeth's family faced significant public scrutiny during this period, particularly around the troubles of her children's marriages and the tragic death of Princess Diana. Her ability to address these sensitive topics in public conversations while maintaining dignity and appropriate boundaries demonstrated another dimension of her conversational mastery. During a visit to a women's shelter, she encountered Sarah Mitchell, a volunteer counselor who worked with women experiencing domestic violence. The conversation began professionally, but gradually became more personal as Sarah shared her own experiences helping families through crisis. "Your Majesty," Sarah said carefully, "many of the women I work with have followed your family's experiences in the media. They often ask me how someone handles personal pain while maintaining public responsibilities. I never know quite how to answer." Elizabeth paused thoughtfully before responding. "That's a very personal question, and I appreciate your sensitivity in asking it," she said. "I think the answer is different for everyone, but I found that focusing on service to others can provide strength during difficult personal times. The work itself becomes a source of healing." The conversation that followed explored themes of resilience, the relationship between public and private life, and the ways that people find meaning during periods of loss and change. Elizabeth spoke honestly about the challenges of balancing family concerns with public duties, while maintaining the privacy and dignity that the situation required. Her response demonstrated years of experience in addressing difficult topics without either hiding from them or revealing inappropriate details. The conversation provided comfort and insights for the counselor while maintaining appropriate boundaries around personal matters. As Elizabeth entered her 90s, her conversations took on new dimensions of historical perspective and wisdom. During a visit to a school celebrating its centenary, she met with teachers, students, and elderly alumni who remembered her early reign. Among them was 92-year-old Margaret Foster, a retired teacher who had attended Elizabeth's coronation as a young woman. "Your Majesty," Margaret said with a smile, "I was thinking about how much education has changed since your coronation. What do you think are the most important things that have remained constant?" Elizabeth considered the question carefully, drawing on nearly 70 years of school visits and educational conversations. "I think the fundamental relationship between teacher and student remains the same," she replied. "The technology changes, the curriculum evolves, but the essential work of helping young people discover their potential and find their place in the world continues." The conversation evolved into a rich discussion about educational philosophy, social change, and the ways that fundamental human needs persist across different eras. Elizabeth shared observations about the thousands of schools she had visited, the innovative teachers she had met, and the remarkable young people who gave her hope for the future. "Every generation faces challenges that seem overwhelming," she reflected, "but I've consistently been impressed by the creativity and determination of young people. They find ways to solve problems that their elders thought were impossible." During her final years, Elizabeth's conversations carried the weight of nearly a century of experience combined with a lifetime of refined listening skills. At a technology summit focused on artificial intelligence and social media, she engaged with experts about the implications of digital communication for human relationships. "Dr. Williams," she said to a leading researcher, "you've studied how people communicate through digital platforms. Do you think these new tools make genuine conversation easier or more difficult? The question sparked a lengthy discussion about authenticity, attention spans, and the ways that technology could either enhance or replace face-to-face interaction. Elizabeth listened intently as experts debated the social implications of digital communication, occasionally asking questions that revealed her deep understanding of human nature and social dynamics. I've spent my life learning that meaningful conversation requires genuine curiosity about other people, she observed. Whether that happens through letters, telephone calls, or digital messages seems less important than whether people approach each other with sincere interest and respect. As her reign drew toward its conclusion, Elizabeth had transformed from a nervous young princess afraid of small talk into perhaps the world's most skilled practitioner of meaningful conversation. She had spoken with presidents and prime ministers, Nobel laureates and school children, celebrities and ordinary citizens, always finding ways to create genuine human connections across every conceivable barrier. Her legacy lay not just in the constitutional role she had fulfilled, but in the hundreds of thousands of individual conversations that had made ordinary people feel seen, heard, and valued. Each interaction had been an opportunity to demonstrate that effective leadership was fundamentally about serving others, listening more than speaking, and finding the common humanity that united people across all their differences. The shy girl who had once dreaded diplomatic receptions had become a master of the most important skill a leader could possess: the ability to make every person she met feel that their story mattered, their concerns were valid, and their contributions were appreciated. In the end, the art of small talk had revealed itself to be the foundation of great leadership and the secret to a life of meaningful service.